The night air outside the Ramstein Officers Club carried the scent of cigar smoke and cold rain on polished asphalt. Inside, beneath chandeliers older than most of the men in uniform, laughter rolled through the golden light like artillery, loud, brash, and unrestrained. It was the annual NATO celebration, a night for medals and whiskey, for power polished to a shine. Brigadier Alan Thorne stood at the center of it all. His laughter boomed louder than the others, chest puffed under the weight of a dozen ribbons, a man who believed his own legend. Every gesture was a performance, the lift of a glass, the wink toward a colonel's wife, the careless joke that turned the room his way. He was the kind of officer who mistook charm for respect. At the far end of the hall, near the window where the light was thin, a janitor pushed a mop in slow, deliberate strokes. His name tag read A. Jenkins. The others barely saw him. The sound of the mop, the soft drag of it over marble, was almost tender, a rhythm out of place in the loud music and speeches. When Thorne caught sight of him, something cruel flickered in his grin. "Careful, boys," he said loud enough for the table to hear. "The help's got clearance to polish our secrets." Laughter followed, quick and nervous. Arthur Jenkins didn't look up. He kept wiping the same spot, calm, steady. Thorne wasn't used to being ignored. He took a few steps closer, boots echoing on the tile. "Hey, old-timer, you miss a spot." His tone sharpened just enough for everyone nearby to pause, sensing the edge in it. Arthur glanced up, his expression unreadable. Weathered skin, gray hair neatly trimmed, eyes that had seen too many years to care about this moment. Then he bent again, wringing the mop in the bucket. That small act, ignoring him again, stung worse than insult. "Come on," Thorne said, picking up his whiskey. "We're celebrating heroes tonight. What's your story, huh? Vietnam? Korea?" Arthur said nothing. The silence stretched. Figures probably never left the supply closet. A few officers chuckled, but it was forced. You could feel the discomfort under the laughter, like static under a song. Someone shifted in their seat. Someone else looked toward the door, hoping the general would lose interest. But Thorne didn't. He was drunk on attention, the cruel kind that grows when no one dares to stop it. Arthur finished his pass, straightened, and turned to leave. The room caught a glint from the mop handle, polished steel catching the chandelier's light. For a split second, his reflection shimmered across the glossy floor, shoulders square, posture too disciplined for a janitor. Then it was gone. Thorne noticed it too. "Look at that," he said, laughing again. "Man stands like he's still at inspection." He reached out and tapped Arthur's shoulder with 2 fingers. "At ease, soldier. The war's over." Arthur's eyes met his, calm, almost pitying, before he moved the mop bucket aside. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, voice rough as gravel. Then he disappeared down the service hall, leaving behind the faint scent of bleach and rain. For a moment, the laughter didn't return. The silence hung there, heavier than before. Thorne shrugged it off, raising his glass again. "Some people don't know when to quit," he muttered, and the crowd laughed on cue. But one colonel near the back, a man with silver hair and tired eyes, didn't join in. He watched the empty doorway where the janitor had gone, frowning faintly, as if a half-forgotten name was tugging at the edge of his memory. Outside, a storm was building over the airfield. Thunder rolled far off, deep and patient. Inside, the chandeliers swayed just slightly, their golden reflections trembling across the floor Arthur had just cleaned. And somewhere, beneath that polished calm, the night was waiting to turn. By the time the storm broke over Ramstein, the celebration had turned rowdy. Lightning flashed through the tall windows, throwing the officers' shadows across the mahogany walls like ghosts of old wars. The band had started up again, a brass section struggling against the chatter of too many drinks and too much pride. Arthur Jenkins had returned quietly, unnoticed at first. He walked along the far end of the hall, near the row of portraits, generals and heroes immortalized in oil and frame. Every few minutes, he'd glance toward the floor, then toward those painted faces, as if cleaning up after their stories. Brigadier Thorne spotted him again. The whiskey had deepened his arrogance into something meaner, a private show that needed a new audience. "There he is," he said, rising from his seat, "the hardest working man in NATO." The laughter followed, half-hearted but obedient. Thorne approached with a deliberate swagger, the kind of stride meant to remind everyone who had the higher rank, even over a janitor. He gestured toward Arthur's mop. "Tell me, old fella, you ever wonder what it's like to matter again? To wear something other than that blue coverall?" Arthur didn't stop his motion. "Can't say I do, sir." That should have been the end of it, but humiliation, once started, is hard to stop for men like Thorne. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not enough to hide the bite. "You know what separates you from me, son?" Arthur looked at him then, slow and steady. "Yes, sir," he said. "A few good decisions." The laughter died this time. Even the band faltered. Thorne's face flushed, the color rising fast beneath his medals. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Arthur returned to the floor, mop sliding through a pool of spilled brandy. "Just answering your question, sir." The tension snapped taut. Officers looked away, pretending to be fascinated by their glasses. A few tried to intervene, nervous smiles, deflecting jokes, but Thorne wouldn't let it go. He reached down, grabbed the bucket, and tipped it just enough to slosh water across Arthur's boots. "Looks like you missed a spot, Chief." Arthur froze. Not in anger, in stillness, the kind that made the air shift like before a boat hits ground. He set the mop aside, reached for a rag in his pocket, and bent down to clean the mess. When his sleeve slid up, the hall seemed to inhale all at once. There, on the inside of his forearm, was a tattoo, black ink faded by years, but sharp enough to recognize. A coiled viper wrapped around a dagger, the blade forming the number 1. For a moment, nobody spoke. The rain hammered the windows like distant gunfire. A colonel at the corner table set his drink down with a trembling hand. "Holy, is that?" He stopped himself, eyes wide. Thorne frowned, looking between them. "What?" The colonel stood slowly. "That mark, it's not supposed to exist anymore." His voice dropped, more reverent than fearful. "That's Viper 1. The name hung in the air like a secret suddenly remembered. Conversations stopped. Even the waiters froze. Thorne scoffed. "Viper 1? Sounds like a bad movie." He turned toward the colonel. "You're telling me this janitor, this nobody, was part of that myth?" But the colonel wasn't laughing. He was staring at Arthur now, eyes full of something close to awe. The operation in East Berlin, 1983. The one that stopped a nuclear standoff before it began. The man who never came home. They said he was dead. Arthur didn't look up. He just kept wiping the water from the floor, the tattoo flexing under his worn skin. "Dead's a strong word," he murmured. Thorne's expression faltered. confusion edging into unease. "What the hell are you saying?" Arthur finally stood. His face was calm, but there was something behind it. Not pride, not anger, something quieter and far older. "I'm saying, sir, that sometimes the ones you stop seeing are the ones who made sure you'd never see the worst." A long silence followed. Outside, thunder cracked close this time, shaking the glass. Then the doors opened. Every head turned as two MPs stepped aside, making room for a tall figure in full dress uniform. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Langford, entered the hall, rain glistening on his coat. Conversations stuttered and died. Thorne straightened instinctively, fixing his uniform, forcing a smile. "General on deck," someone said, too late, too formal. Langford scanned the room once, then saw Arthur. His posture changed instantly. Not shock, recognition. He crossed the floor without a word. The sound of his boots echoed sharp against marble. The officers watched, breath held, as he stopped in front of the janitor who wasn't a janitor. Arthur looked up, expression unreadable. Langford's voice was steady, quiet enough to make the silence heavier. "It's been a long time, sir." Then, before anyone could process it, the four-star commander straightened to attention and saluted. Gasps rippled across the room. Chairs scraped. Thorne's jaw went slack. Arthur hesitated for a second, then returned the salute. A simple motion, precise and practiced. The storm raged against the windows, flashes of light cutting through the room, catching the two men in silhouette, one drenched in metals, the other in humility. Langford lowered his hand, nodding once. "Welcome home, Viper 1." Arthur's reply was barely a whisper. "Didn't know I ever laughed." Behind them, Brigadier Thorne stood frozen, eyes darting between them, understanding too late what he'd done. The laughter that had filled the room an hour ago was gone, replaced by a silence thick enough to hear the hum of the lights. The colonel from earlier raised his glass slowly, not in toast, but in respect. One by one, others followed. No orders, no speeches, just the quiet sound of men standing for the one they'd forgotten. Arthur didn't bask in it. He simply nodded once, turned back toward his cot, and resumed his work. The mop's rhythm returned, soft, measured, steady. Thorne tried to speak, but no sound came out. The storm outside began to fade, leaving only the soft patter of rain and the steady whisper of a man cleaning the floor where pride had fallen. And in that fragile quiet, the truth lingered, that valor, the real kind, never asked to be seen. It simply endured. The next morning, the base felt different, not outwardly. The jet still screamed across the gray German sky, the gate still clanged shut, the radio still hummed with static and routine. But there was something in the air, a quiet that wasn't peace, a respect that hadn't been there before. News of the night before had spread through Ramstein faster than fuel through a line. No one said it aloud in the open, but everyone knew. The janitor wasn't a janitor. The man who polished the floors and fixed the vending machines had once been NATO's most lethal shadow. A ghost story soldiers whispered when the Cold War turned coldest. Arthur Jenkins, Viper 1, didn't look different that morning. He wore the same uniform, pushed the same cart, and greeted the same people with the same quiet nod. But when he entered the mess hall, conversation slowed by instinct. Soldiers who once brushed past him now moved aside. No one dared meet his eyes too long, afraid of what they might see looking back. He didn't linger on it. Respect, like fear, had a way of rotting what it touched. Arthur had lived long enough to know the line between them was thin. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of jet fuel and damp earth. He lit a cigarette behind the maintenance hangar, his first in years. The flame flickered weakly in the wind before catching. Smoke curled around the wrinkles in his face, hiding the faint scar under his jaw. "Didn't think you smoked anymore," a voice said behind him. Arthur didn't turn. "Didn't think I worked here either." General Langford stepped into view, coat unbuttoned, eyes tired from too many years of watching men become myths and myths become men again. He looked at Arthur for a long moment before speaking. "You could have told someone you were alive." Arthur exhaled, smoke drifting into the cold. Would have ruined the story. Langford shook his head. "That story cost you everything." Arthur flicked the ash. "It cost what it had to." Silence hung between them. Langford leaned against the railing beside him, the weight of command pressing down invisibly. "You know Thorne's being reassigned. They're calling it a loss of confidence." He hesitated. "You could have asked for worse." Arthur's gaze stayed on the flight line. "I didn't ask for anything." Langford nodded slowly. "That's what makes you dangerous. Always has." A jet thundered past, shaking the ground beneath their boots. Arthur watched it climb into the low clouds, its afterburner fading into mist. Dangerous men believe in something. I stopped believing a long time ago. Langford turned to face him. "That's not true. You believed in staying invisible. You believed in protecting what was left of us." Arthur gave a faint smile. "And look how that turned out. The ghosts always come back, John." Langford studied him quietly. "You're not a ghost, Art. You're what we should have been." Arthur didn't answer. He just took another drag and crushed the cigarette beneath his heel. By afternoon, the entire base seemed to hold its breath when Arthur passed. Some nodded, some couldn't. A few young airmen whispered about him like school children around a campfire. The man who stopped a war with a single bullet, the one the Russians couldn't catch, the Phantom from Berlin. None of them got it right, but Arthur didn't bother correcting them. The truth was uglier than legend, and legend was easier to live with. Inside the officers' club, Thorne sat alone in the corner booth, the same one he'd owned with laughter the night before. His uniform was still pressed, but his eyes were hollow. He looked like a man who'd seen his reflection for the first time and didn't like who stared back. Arthur came in without looking for him, pushing his card toward the far table. Thorne's voice stopped him. "Why didn't you tell me?" Arthur turned. "Tell you what?" "That you were him." Thorne's words stumbled. "You let me make a fool of myself." Arthur studied him quietly, then said, "No, you did that on your own." Thorne flinched. "You think you're better than me?" Arthur shook his head. "No, sir, just older." Thorne pushed up from his chair, fists clenched, but there was no fight left in him. Only guilt, confusion, and the sting of exposure. "They're saying I'll be sent stateside. Some desk in Virginia if I'm lucky." His laugh was bitter. "I humiliated a hero. That's what the reports will say." Arthur leaned on a mop handle. "You humiliated yourself. You just use me to do it." Thorne sank back into the booth, voice breaking under the weight of something unfamiliar. Shame. You don't understand what it's like. The pressure, the expectation. You get lost in it. Arthur nodded slowly. Yeah, I do. Thorne looked up, confused. Arthur's eyes were calm, distant. The eyes of a man who'd once done terrible things in the name of good. That's how it starts, Arthur continued. You believe your own rank. Then you stop seeing people as people, just pieces on a board. You think you're leading them. Then one day you look around and you're alone. The brigadier stared at him for a long time. And you are not alone? Arthur's voice softened. Everyone's alone, sir. Some of us just made peace with it. That night, the base bar was empty except for Arthur and the bartender. A slow blues song played from an old speaker, low and scratchy. Arthur sat at the far end, sipping black coffee, watching the rain start again through the window. A young airman approached, barely 20. Sir, Mr. Jenkins, he stammered. I just wanted to say, my father served in Kosovo. Said he'd heard about Viper 1. Said if I ever met him, I should say thank you. Arthur looked up, surprised by the sincerity. Your father's kind. Tell him I said the same. The kid nodded awkwardly and left, leaving Arthur alone with his reflection in the bar mirror. Older now, smaller somehow. He didn't see a legend there, just a tired man who'd spent too long cleaning up after other people's mistakes. Lamford joined him a few minutes later, 2 glasses in hand. One for old times, he said. Arthur raised an eyebrow. There are no old times worth toasting. Langford grinned faintly. Then here's to the ones we survived. They drank in silence for a while. The bass quieted outside, the rain steady. Langford finally asked, What happened in Berlin, Arthur? The real story, not the file. Arthur didn't look at him. You already know. I know what the paper said. Arthur's gaze stayed on the rain-streaked glass. 3 hostages, 1 bomb, 1 choice. That's all it ever was. Langford nodded slowly, not pressing. Some memories were minefields best left unwalked. After a while, Arthur stood. I should get back. The morning floors don't clean themselves. Langford smiled softly. You really going back to that? Arthur met his eyes. Someone's got to. He walked out into the rain, head bare, hands deep in his pockets. The storm washed over him, cold and relentless, but he didn't rush for cover. Every step echoed across the empty lot, his silhouette swallowed by mist. Behind him, the lights of the officers' club glowed faintly, warm, distant, and small against the darkness. Inside those walls, men told stories of war and valor, but outside, the man who'd lived them just kept walking, unseen, unneeded, and finally, unburdened. By the end of that week, the base command announced a ceremony. Nothing grand, nothing public, just a recognition of exceptional service at the old airfield hangar. The kind of event they hold when history has become too inconvenient to ignore. Arthur didn't want to go. He tried to tell Langford that. You don't drag ghosts into the light, he'd said. But the general insisted. This isn't about you, Langford told him quietly. It's about what you gave up so the rest of us could stand here pretending we built peace. So, on a pale Saturday morning, under a sky the color of aluminum, Arthur Jenkins put on the only suit he owned, a plain gray thing, threadbare at the cuffs, and walked across the tarmac toward Hangar 3. Inside, rows of soldiers sat in folding chairs, uniforms crisp, boots polished. No brass band, no speeches about glory, just a single podium, a flag, and Langford waiting near it with a file pressed to his chest. Brigadier Thorne was there too, in full dress uniform, face pale, hands locked behind his back like a man awaiting sentence. The hangar doors were half open, letting in the sound of wind through steel. It smelled of oil and dust and memory. Langford stepped forward first. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today we acknowledge something we weren't supposed to remember." He looked over at Arthur. Decades ago, when the world stood on a knife's edge, there were men who did their duty in places that never existed. They signed no contracts, wore no medals, and carried their ghosts alone. One of them is standing here. Arthur shifted slightly, uncomfortable under the weight of so many eyes. Langford continued. "This base, this alliance, owes more to that kind of silence than it does to all the speeches ever made in its name." He paused, letting the words fall flat and honest. Then he opened the file, took out a small velvet box, and held it out. "Arthur Jenkins, Viper 1, for extraordinary service in defense of peace and for the humility that followed it, you are hereby recognized with NATO's Distinguished Service Medal." Arthur didn't move. The medal caught a shard of light from the hangar door, glinting faintly like something unearthly. He looked at it, then at Langford, then slowly shook his head. "I don't need that." Langford's voice softened. "It's not for you. It's for the ones who forgot." Arthur hesitated, then stepped forward. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the box, closing it without looking inside. He didn't salute, didn't speak, just nodded once, a small human gesture that felt truer than any ceremony. Langford returned the nod and stepped back. For a moment, the silence held. Then came the sound. Slow, deliberate, one pair of hands clapping. It was Thorne, standing alone, clapping once every 2 seconds, eyes fixed on the floor. Then another officer joined in, then another. Soon the entire hangar echoed with applause, restrained at first, then steady, then full. It rolled like distant thunder, filling the cold space with something close to warmth. Arthur stood motionless in the middle of it, not basking in it, not rejecting it, just absorbing it, the way a dry sponge takes water. Maybe for the first time in years, he let himself feel seen. Langford leaned toward him. "You all right?" Arthur gave the faintest smile. "I've been worse." After the ceremony, people approached, officers, pilots, even base staff, each offering a hand, a thank you, a word too small for what they felt. Arthur listened politely, said little. He could see the sincerity in their eyes, but also the distance, the way heroism becomes safer when it belongs to someone else. As the hangar emptied, Thorne lingered by the exit, waiting. When Arthur finally walked past him, the brigadier spoke quietly. "I wanted to apologize." Arthur stopped but didn't turn. "You already did, sir, the night you looked in the mirror." Thorne swallowed. "You don't have to forgive me." Arthur finally faced him. "I don't, but I don't carry it either." Thorne's shoulders sagged. "They're sending me to Langley. Ground assignment." Arthur nodded. "That's still sky, if you look hard enough." Thorne tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "How do you live with it? The mistakes?" Arthur thought for a long moment before answering. You don't. You just stop pretending they aren't there. Then he offered his hand. Thorne took it, hesitantly at first, then firmly. A small wordless truce between the man who had power and the man who once had purpose. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Arthur stood on the edge of the airfield, watching a transport plane taxi toward the runway. The engines roared, the sound vibrating through his chest like a memory. Langford came up beside him, coat flapping in the gusts. You know, Langford said, they're calling you a legend again. Arthur kept his eyes on the plane. That's how they make sure I never have to explain what really happened. Langford sighed. You could write it down? Already did, Arthur said. You just call it a classified file. They both laughed softly, the kind that comes from two men too old to care about the politics of truth. As the plane lifted off, Langford asked, You ever miss it? Arthur's gaze followed the rise in silhouette until it disappeared into the clouds. Every day, he said. Then, after a pause, but I miss the people more than the mission. Langford nodded. You could come back, you know. Train recruits, teach them what you know. Arthur shook his head. What I know doesn't fit in a classroom. Langford looked at him, reading the finality in his tone. So what now? Arthur smiled faintly. There's always another floor to clean. That night, as the base quieted and the hangar lights dimmed, Arthur returned to his janitor's closet. The same mop, the same bucket, the same hum of the vending machine outside. But the air felt lighter now, like a storm that had finally burned itself out. He opened the velvet box once, just to see. The metal inside glowed faintly in the fluorescent light. Gold, cold, impersonal. He ran his thumb over the engraving. For service beyond recognition. Arthur closed it again and set it on the shelf beside a pack of cigarettes and a small photograph. A black and white picture of 3 young men standing in front of a Berlin safe house, grinning through the dirt and fear. 2 of them were gone now. The third had spent 30 years pretending to be. He sat down on the wooden stool, hands folded loosely, and let the quiet wrap around him. The ghosts were softer now, less cruel. They didn't haunt, they watched. Outside, a jet screamed overhead. Young pilots training for wars they didn't yet understand. Arthur listened until the sound faded into nothing, then whispered under his breath, almost to himself. Keep it steady, boys. Keep it human. Then he stood, picked up the mop, and went back to work. The following week, Rammstein returned to its rhythm. Engines, orders, weather reports. History folded itself back into silence, as it always does. But the silence felt different now. Not empty, watchful. The story of the janitor who wasn't spread in quiet corners. The younger airmen stopped laughing so loud in the mess hall. They began standing when the cleaning crew passed. Not because they'd been told to, because they wanted to. Respect had found a new language on base, one that didn't need medals or ceremonies. Arthur kept his same routine. He rose before dawn, made his coffee, and walked across the flight line before the sun lifted over the hangars. Some mornings, Langford joined him for a few minutes of quiet conversation. Most mornings, Arthur preferred the company of wind and jet noise. The world made more sense when no one was talking. He never wore the medal. It stayed in its box on the shelf above the sink, next to that fading photograph. Every now and then, he dusted, not out of pride, but habit. Some things just deserve to be kept clean. One evening near sunset, he passed through the officers' club again. Empty now, lights dimmed, the smell of polish still faint in the air. He stopped under the chandelier where the storm had shaken it that night. The marble floor gleamed like water. His reflection looked back at him. An old man in a blue coverall, shoulders straight, eyes steady. He smiled a little. "Looks about right," he muttered. Footsteps echoed behind him. Thorne's voice, quiet. "Arthur?" Arthur turned. The younger man looked smaller without his uniform jacket, sleeves rolled up, medals gone. He carried a broom. "They reassigned me early," he said. "Flight leaves tomorrow. Thought I'd get a head start on learning humility." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "That broom's a good teacher." Thorne nodded, then began sweeping in silence beside him. For a moment, the two men worked side by side. No rank, no audience, just two lives intersecting in the echo of their mistakes. When they finished, Thorne leaned the broom against the wall and looked at him. "You were right," he said softly. "The floor sees everything." Arthur smiled faintly. "It remembers more than people do." Thorne hesitated, then offered his hand again. This time Arthur took it without words. It felt like closure, small and real. When Thorne left, Arthur stayed behind. He stood in the empty hall, listening to the quiet hum of the lights. Outside, dusk had settled over the base, the kind of soft German twilight that blurs everything into shades of gray. Through the open window, the wind carried a sound, faint at first, then clear. A formation returning from night training. The jets cut across the horizon, trails glowing orange against the last light of day. Arthur watched them pass, eyes narrowing slightly, remembering how it felt to be up there, unseen and vital. The world didn't know the names of men like him, and that was fine. Ghosts don't need names. They just make sure the living get to keep theirs. He turned off the lights, leaving only the golden reflection of the runway lights flickering across the polished floor. For a moment, they looked like stars trapped under glass. Then he whispered, not a prayer, not a farewell, just a truth simple enough to last. "It's enough to have done it." Arthur walked out into the cool evening, hands in his pockets, boots clicking softly against the tile. Behind him, the door swung shut, and the light inside faded to black. Out on the airfield, the wind caught a piece of paper from his cot and carried it away, spinning, rising, disappearing into the night sky. And for those who served there long after, the story of the quiet man who mopped the floors lived on, passed down like an inheritance no one wanted to admit they needed. Because every base, every war, every generation has its ghosts. And sometimes the bravest ones never stop cleaning up the mess we leave behind.